Wow. Okay, what type of person was he looking for?
Well, as we spoke earlier, he never made an error in choosing a victim. He always chose prostitutes who were either sick, ill in some way, drunk, certainly not full capacity. So he never made an error in choosing a victim. They're all prostitutes, either full or part-time. A lot of women were there just prostituting just to make a meal, to be honest with you. Never an average woman, never anybody sleeping raw. All very weak and drunk in general bad health. In other words, he was essentially a coward. He was picking the weak off the group.
Wow, it sounds like most serial killers that we know today.
Indeed, that's quite true. Yeah, picking the weaker.
Yeah, trying to pick on the weak, try to find somebody, children of the weak, women. Yeah.
Exactly.
I understand the next victim was killed in a small backyard?
Yes, now this is an interesting one, historically speaking, of course. It's September the 8th, 1888, and that would be Annie Chapman. She's a 47-year-old prostitute, like the others. She had no money for her bed. She'd been drinking it. She'd probably gotten her money for her bed 2 or 3 times that day. She drank it away. She was a drunk, or at least worse for wear, when she was met by Elizabeth Long. This was 5:30 in the morning. She's been trying to find enough people, I guess, to pay for her douse all night. Elizabeth Long sees Chapman, Annie Chapman, in front of 29 Hanbury Street. She only sees the man from behind, but Elizabeth Long becomes a witness to the man who probably killed Annie Chapman. So we're talking about from behind. Now, here's what Elizabeth Long said. Quote, dark complexion, was wearing a brown deerstalker hat. I think he was wearing a dark overcoat, but cannot be sure. He was a man over 40, as far as I could tell. And she continued, he seemed a little taller than the deceased. He looked to me like a foreigner, as well as I could make out. He looked like I should call shabby genteel, close quote. Well, a few minutes after she saw Annie Chapman in front of 29 Hanbury Street, they go into the backyard. Chapman is dead. Now, this is where the major mutilations begin and the body parts start being picked up. Her throat was deeply cut again. Abdomen was laid open. Uterus, upper vagina, and part of her bladder was removed and taken away. So all those body parts were taken away by Jack the Ripper. The intestines were pulled out and laid over her shoulder. So it's pretty much a disgusting sight. Now, the critical part of this is that 2 rings were pulled off her fingers. They were never located. So in the future, we'll be discussing about what happened to those rings, because they could be very critical to solving this case.
Well, who was the primary investigator at this point?
The primary investigator was Inspector Frederick George Abilene. He was in Scotland Yard headquarters. Now, Abilene had spent several years, I think about 15 years, in H Division, which was Whitechapel. Well known, well respected, did a very good job. He was called in as a top investigator at the street level for the Ripper murders because government was getting a little antsy, because even though Whitechapel was an area known to be criminal, semi-criminal, a lot of crime there, badly lit, all kinds of problems, fights, all kinds of things going on. But this was something unique. Murders were not unique, mostly people who knew each other. Fights, bar fights, a lot of bars, a lot of pubs. But somebody killing people and not being found, killing strangers and taking body parts, this was something unique that they had to snuff as fast as they could. So they sent in one of their top investigators, and that was Inspector Frederick George Abilene.
I take it he was from Scotland Yard?
He was Scotland Yard. He had been H Division for a long time. He made chief inspector a little later, but they called him back. They called him back to H Division, even though I'm sure he was happy to be out of that area for this particular case. So he was the investigator. Right? He was in charge of the case at the street level. He wasn't the top officer in charge, but he was in charge of basically the intense investigation at the street level. Yeah.
Okay, where did the name Jack the Ripper come from?
Well, that's an interesting question. The Dear Boss letter was mailed on September the 25th, 1888. And this is what gave the name. This was sent to the Central News Agency in London, like the AP or UPS, things like that. Received on September the 27th. It claimed to have come from the killer. And here's what it said, this part of it. Quote, Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me yet. Now it ended with, I want to get right back to work if I get a chance. Good luck, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. And then finally, quote, don't mind me giving the trade name. Well, it's understood now by people who have investigated the crime series and everything that this was written probably by a reporter named Best from the Star newspaper. That was a radical newspaper, more of a, what would you say these days? One that puts out stories that are not necessarily real, viable, but enhanced quite a bit. Or Tom Billing, who actually worked for the Central News Agency. So it came basically from a newsman. None of the so-called Ripper letters, any of them, ever came from the killer. Not a single one. And there was maybe a couple of hundred that were written and sent. It did, however, give the killer the name that stuck. That was Jack the Ripper.
Well, Michael, in one night, I heard there were actually 2 murders. Tell me about the double event.
Yeah, the double event is again, controversial because there are 2 at one point. It occurred on September the 29th, 30th, 1888. The first one was Elizabeth Stride. Now, again, we're going back to Flower and Dean Street. She lived on Flower and Dean Street. You're going to be hearing about that for pretty much throughout this entire situation.
Okay.
She's a working prostitute. She passed on several potential customers, which is kind of key to the understanding of this particular murder. If she's a working prostitute, why should we turn down customers? So she was waiting for a special person on Berners Street. Now, it's late in the evening. She hasn't found any customers yet. She's talked to several people, even some of her customers. She shuffled them all off. Berners Street had the International Working Man's Educational Club, a socialist club, had about 100 members. This is where they found her body, next to that club. Now, it's 1 a.m. Louis Dimschitz, who's an individual who sells cheap jewelry from a cart. He has his cart pony and everything like that. He's moving his cart in to bring it in the back because he's finished his work. The horse shears up. There's something there he can't see. It's so dark in that area, you can't really even see a body. Mm-hmm. So he has to strike a match to see who was down there. Originally, he thought it was his wife drunk. So he said, yeah, the heck with it. I'm going to go in. We'll let her sleep it off, whatever it is. Finds his wife is there, still in the working man's club, goes outside, strikes a match, finds it's Elizabeth Stride. Doesn't know who she is, but obviously it's not his wife. But she has the throat cut. Now, the key point here is that there are no mutilations. Just a murder. Now, another key point is that when they were investigating her murder, one of the socialist club members, reported that a man had been at the club earlier who lived in George Yard dwellings. And that possibly he was a Russian and reported a medical man. Now, my question for Scotland Yard at that point would have been, if you've got someone murdered in the George Yard dwellings, that's Martha Tabram, and you've got another connection to the George Yard dwellings from this murder, why didn't they investigate? And to be honest with you, there is no investigation of that particular report. So this could possibly be at a point where they actually completely missed it. They might have gotten him if he was still there, because this is about the 4th or 5th murder.
Okay.
So he's there for 2.
Mm-hmm.
So if they would have written down every name. Now, what people don't realize mostly is that every single man in that building when Martha Tabram was killed was interviewed. So that's potentially the first Ripper murder composite, as we talked about before. But no one was arrested. But if this was a Ripper murder, then they were facing Jack the Ripper on the very first murder, and they interviewed him, which is not necessarily unique in serial killer cases. Sometimes they'll interview the right guy 3, 4, 5, 6 times before they realize, okay, this is the guy we have to focus on. He keeps coming up. Well, I think they missed this one. Now, the reason why I think this is a hit, and this is just my theory, is that he mistook Elizabeth Stride, whose nickname was Long Liz, because she was a tall woman.
Okay. So
her nickname is Long Liz. The woman who saw the killer with Chapman at Hanbury Street was named Elizabeth Long. So we have Elizabeth Long and Long Liz. So I think this was a hit. Now, at this point, the killer is moving during that early morning towards Mitre Square. I don't think he took Elizabeth Stride for a body part. He just had to kill her. So wherever she was at, he was going to kill her. But now he's got to get his second victim. We're talking about the double event. Now he's going to go for the body parts. Now we're talking about Catherine Nitto. She's a 46-year-old prostitute again. Now she lived on Thrall Street. Now what's interesting about Thrall Street is that it's right between Flower and Dean Street and George Yard dwellings. It's right between his work and the home of Severino Kozlowski. Now, if you were to talk about any other suspect in this case, no one, and I mean no one, lived where he was at, and no one would have been in that exact area and have a business and a home between one of these victims rather. And there were several of them that fit that pattern. She had been found earlier drunk and taken to the drunk tank. Well, that was pretty average for these prostitutes back then in the Middle East End of London. You know, a lot of drinking going on, a lot of prostitution going on. But she was finally released as being good enough to release out on her own. She wouldn't fall in front of a cart or something like that. She was released at 12:55 a.m. and it was written down that she was, quote, sober enough, close quote. She wasn't totally sober, but she was, sober enough. At 1:30 a.m., we have Constable Edward Watkins patrolling Mitre Square. Now, he's patrolling it himself. Mitre Square is empty. It's a 15-minute patrol. So he's going through at 1:30 a.m. Less than 15 minutes for the killer to operate. It's 1:45 a.m. Watkins patrols Mitre Square again and finds Edo's mutilated body. So now you're in the middle of the Whitechapel area. On the edge of it is Mitre Square. There's a cop that's gone through every 15 minutes.
Okay.
And you're sitting there in a quasi-dark area trying to take out body parts, knowing that someone could find you at any second. Now, her throat was cut, Ripper style. She had been strangled. And her left kidney had been removed, and part of the womb had been removed, and her face had been mutilated, but not as much as one later on. Now, what's interesting, we have a report here from Frederick Brown. He was one of the doctors, did the postmortem. And he reported, quote, "I should say that someone who knew the position of the kidney must have done it." Now, he continued, "I believe the perpetrator of the act must have had considerable knowledge of the position of the organs in the abdominal cavity and the way of removing them. It required a great deal of knowledge to have removed the kidney and to know where it was placed." Now, again, we're reminded, 1886 in Warsaw, Poland, 2 years earlier, Severino Kozlowski got his junior surgical degree. Now, this report essentially eliminates 99% of the men in East End of London. I mean, how many junior surgeons do we have, wandering around a ghetto in 1888? And it eliminates also most of the suspects. So we're getting really close to pinpointing Severino Kozlowski. Now, again, we have to realize that at this point, he had to have realized that he was risking his life every time he went out. Because if he would have been caught, they would have executed him. So the question becomes, what is the major driving force that's making him go out there and risk his life for these body parts? Nobody really knows because there was no trial, no conviction. We couldn't ask him that, but something was driving him. Now, there was one last event that night that was kind of controversial, and it evolves around a few blocks away from Mitre Square. A bloody apron was found. Now, between Mitre Square and Central Ripper area, where you've got Flower and Dean Street, he's walking towards the east end or the center of Whitechapel. Now, on the wall was some graffiti, and here's what the graffiti said, and that's why it's controversial. Quote, "The Jewess," and they wrote it Jewes, "the Jewess are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," close quote. Now, there were a lot of Jewish folks that lived in the area, so the authorities erased the graffiti because they didn't want to have riots. So we were never able to confirm exactly what the handwriting was. Therefore, it's always going to be controversial because we don't have a photograph of it. They erased it before you could get a photograph of it. Even the spelling and the wording is controversial because there were a couple of constables who wrote it down, They wrote it down slightly differently. So the only thing that ties it to a Ripper murder is the fact that a piece of apron that was confirmed to have been her apron, Edo's apron, was left right in front of the graffiti. So it's dealer's choice as to whether or not it's from the killer or he just saw it and threw it down there.
So basically they had their man, they let him get away, and he went out and killed again?
Well, they had a possibility of getting him if they were going to go to the George Yard dwellings. They might have been able to interview him and find some evidence there, but other than a confession and finding him standing over a body, it would have been difficult. There's no forensics. There's no blood tracing. There's no fingerprints. There's nothing that would have tied him. So if he would have stuck to a story that he wasn't the killer, even if they were facing him again, they might not have been able to tie him to any of the murders.
Let me ask you a question, Michael.
Okay.
Maybe a little off base. Were the Jewish residents of London being persecuted at the time?
They were in mainland Europe. The pogroms were going on in Russia. They were being mistreated. So a lot of people were leaving there, coming to America, coming to England, coming to any area that wasn't Poland was one of the areas that was occurring. So yeah, they were being mistreated, but not as much as you would have in like World War II, this kind of situation. But people don't also understand that originally, maybe 100 years earlier, the Whitechapel area was a rich Jewish area.
Wow, interesting.
And it was near the docks. They had businesses going on, a lot of commercialism going on, and these folks were very good at doing business. And what happened was they cleaned out the square mile central of London to make it basically governmental. So hordes of people were basically moved out of central London, and a lot of them who were poor, couldn't go anywhere, went to the East End. So you got an area that was relatively well kept, a Jewish area, and then it became overran by all kinds of people. So now you have the original people who've been there for generations, different ethnic groups, etc. You have the poverty people that were moving in. You had transients going through. You had the docks. So it really became a semi-criminal area.
Wow, interesting. Were there any authentic letters or any other correspondence sent to the authorities by, the serial killer Jack the Ripper?
Well, as a matter of fact, there was one, and it's called The Letter from Hell. Now, George Lusk was a builder, contractor, and he started the Mile End Vigilance Committee. Now, the one key point that I keep seeing reported is that he was a member of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. That was formed after Martha Taborn was killed by people in the Whitechapel. He formed the Mile End Vigilance Committee to help the police in any way, go out on patrols, funding rewards, etc. He received a small package in the mail on October 16, 1888, after the double event and after the Dear Boss letter. Now, inside the little package, about maybe 6 inches square, was a note and half a kidney. Now, this is now the well-known Letter from Hell. Okay? And what's interesting about that is that they have lost the original letter. They do not have the original Letter from Hell. We have a photograph of it, so we can get an idea of what it said. And if I can read right here real quick, it says, Mr. Lusk, Sor, S-O-R, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you can only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch Me When You Can, Mr. Lusk. Now, pathologist Dr. Thomas Oppenshine reported on the kidney itself, not the letter. He reported that, quote, it was female, part of a left kidney, signs of heavy drinking, that would have been Bright's disease, removed at the time of the Mitre Square murder, preserved in spirits. And he was talking about wine. Now, there's also a report on the kidney, again, by Chief Inspector Swanson. He was Abilene's boss. He made a report, and it's very critical. He said, quote, the result of the combined medical opinion they have taken upon it is that it is a kidney of a human adult, not charged with a fluid, as it would have been in the case of a body handed over for purposes of dissection to a hospital, but rather as it would have been the case when it was taken from the body, not so, destined. Now, we also have a report from Police Commissioner Major Henry Smith, his boss. He said, quote, "The renal artery is about 3 inches long." He continued, 2 inches remained in the corpse, that was Catherine Nitto, the Mitre Square victim. 1 inch was attached to the kidney. The kidney left in the corpse was in advanced stage of Bright's disease. The kidney was in an exactly similar state. Now, close quote. Now, the question is, and there's controversy whether this was sent by the killer, because if it is, we've got his handwriting. The question is, and nobody can answer this correctly, how many women in London had a kidney brutally removed in that time frame? Well, the answer is simple. There's only one. So there cannot be any doubt that this was the kidney of a Ripper victim. So we have his handwriting. So we should be able to match his handwriting, his syntax of that note with someone. So that is a major clue. And over the years, there's been a lot of controversy about this. But just recently, within the past few years, it's been accepted by people that call themselves Ripperologists and people who study the case. It's just about now that they're accepting that this was from the killer.